Here's to anyone who's ever looked up. The airheads. And the space cases.
Live long and prosper.
The flight fanatics. The armchair astronauts. And the casually curious. Here's to those who know the thrust in newtons of a Pratt & Whitney J75 turbojet engine. And those who silently ask, what's keeping this thing in the air? Here's to those who can list the name, mission history, and favorite breakfast of every Mercury astronaut. And those who've ever searched for, how does a toilet work in space? Here's to the people who know a P-38 Lightning from a P-51 Mustang. And the people who thought those were the names of cars. Those captivated by the miracle of flight. And those who are just happy to make their flight. So whatever captures your curiosity,
we choose to go to the moon,
or propels you to new heights. When it comes to the sky, there's space for all of us.
Good evening. I'm Chris Brown, and it's my privilege to serve as the John and Adrienne Mars Director of the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum. For those of you joining us in person here at the Airbus IMAX Theater, welcome to the Stephen F. Udvar-Hazy Center, and greetings to everyone tuning in online. I'm pleased to welcome you to this year's Amelia Earhart Lecture in Aviation History. This program is our premier aviation lecture each spring, named in honor of Amelia Earhart. One of the most well-known aviators of all time, Earhart was a true giant of early aviation and a barrier breaker throughout her career. This lecture series explores and spotlights figures in aviation that chart their own course, succeeding where others thought they could not go, and redefining what it means to be a pilot or aviator. For tonight's program, we are joined by U.S. Navy fighter pilot and commercial airline pilot, Tammie Jo Shults. Like many of us, her journey to aviation began as a child, marveling at the aircraft from Holloman Air Force Base flying over her home and reading about incredible aviation exploits. After college, Tammie Jo decided that despite the barriers, she would pursue a career as a pilot. She did, becoming one of the first female fighter pilots to serve in the U.S. Navy. After her military service, she became an airline pilot and gained national renown in 2018 when she safely landed Southwest Airlines Flight 1380 after the airline suffered an uncontained engine failure. In 2019, Captain Schultz wrote a book about that experience and her career called Nerves of Steel. After tonight's lecture, she will be signing copies of the book, so do stop by to purchase a copy and introduce yourself. As this lecture is named after Amelia Earhart, it's fitting that Schultz has drawn a lot of inspiration from Earhart's own words that, quote, adventure is worthwhile. Tonight, Captain Schultz will reflect on her aviation career, which she called the adventure of a lifetime. Before we get started, I do want to make a point of thanking our friends at Pratt & Whitney, an RTX business, who have been generous sponsors of this marquee aviation lecture for many years and are our sponsor again tonight. We appreciate their help as we continue to share aviation history with our audiences in person and online. And joining us in the audience tonight is Kim Kinsley, Pratt & Whitney's Vice President of Mature Commercial Engines and President of IAE. Welcome, Kim, and our sincere thanks to you and Pratt & Whitney for your support. And with that, I would now like to turn it over to Aeronautics Curator Dorothy Cochran to introduce tonight's speaker. Dorothy?
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome everyone here and online. I'm pleased to host this year's Amelia Earhart Lecture in Aviation History with Tammie Jo Shults, a person who can claim a presence in several different chapters of aviation history. At first glance, Tammie Jo's aviation career could be called typical. There was a well-traveled route of joining the military to serve your country as a pilot, and then changing gears and becoming a commercial airline pilot. Thousands of pilots had done that before. There was just one catch. In the 1990s, very few women had done that, and it made it quite the challenge. Entering two male-dominated professions takes a strong will, AKA a lot of guts, confidence in one's choices, and the courage to manage the incidents and remarks that come along to claim a long-sought prize. She succeeded not just once, but twice. In fact, we felt her quest to fly fighter aircraft was so compelling that we captured it as part of the museum's Military Women Aviation Oral History Initiative. She's one of 16 women, retired, current, or military women pilots, to share their experiences from the 1970s to the present, as they sought to, or finally achieved, fully vested combat pilot status and leadership positions. Each one pushed a little bit further. Schultz's ultimate feat of professionalism in the face of extreme adversity came on a beautiful day for flying in 2018. And here is some audio from that event.
Southwest 1380 has an engine fire descending.
Southwest 1380, you're descending right now?
Yes, sir, we're single engine descending, have a fire number 1.
1380, can I get the fuel in pounds and the exact nature of the emergency, please?
Engine severe damage, engine failure.
1380, you're on approach frequency 128.4. You're where you should be. Maintain 4,000. And do you need any further assistance from me? What type of final do you want? I heard short or long.
Yeah, we're going to need a long final.
And when you get a chance, I need fuel remaining and souls on board.
Okay, 149 souls on board, 5 hours of fuel. Okay, could you have the medical meet us there on the runway as well? We've got injured passengers.
Injured passengers, okay. And is your airplane physically on fire?
No, it's not on fire, but part of it's missing. They said there was a hole and someone went out.
Well, that gets your attention. So, as Amelia Earhart explained, it's a routine. I set records and then I lecture on it. I believe our speaker can relate to that. Please welcome Tammie Jo Shults.
Good evening. Chris, thank you for the introduction. Dorothy, for the invitation. This has been a bright spot on my calendar for quite some time. Amelia Earhart's quote, "Adventure is worthwhile," caught my eye many years ago. And after looking into her life, beyond the records, beyond her profession, and the woman behind that, the girl behind the woman, I realized this was a woman who had been benched as much as she had been airborne, and had realized that adventure has a winsome way of pulling us off that bench in life and back on our feet, better prepared to face even bigger challenges ahead. I think one of the treasures that we find in our museums and in face-to-face meeting, one of the treasures is the true stories that we learn, that we exchange. There will always be a nested truth in a true story. Sometimes the takeaway is immediate, and sometimes we tuck it away for perspective later. In light of that, I am happy to tell you part of my story tonight. And I'd like to begin by sharing a little bit of William Cullen Bryant's poem, To a Waterfowl. He was a young man facing a lot of opposition in his choice of profession, not because he couldn't do it, but because others thought he shouldn't do it. And as he was headed home one day, he saw a solitary waterfowl lift off the lake and head south, intuitively, to warmer weather, no piers in sight. And he decided we are often drawn to exactly what we're suited for. And he went home, stayed his course, and penned this poem, ending with, "He who from zone to zone guides through the boundless sky thy certain flight, in the long way that I must tread alone, will lead my steps aright." I have kept that dusted off since high school. It has been applicable, I think, to my trek through aviation. I didn't grow up around aviation. I grew up underneath it as the jets from Holloman Air Force Base anchored their dogfighting practice over our big hay barn. I was usually mucking out stalls or stock trailers of organic fertilizer when I would see this air show overhead. I started collecting books and reading about pilots and airplanes, and I came across and met my first aviation hero, Nate Saint, on the pages of Jungle Pilot. I saw how he had found his way into aviation through the military, and I could see a faint footpath emerging from barnyard to cockpit for myself. A few years later, when I was in high school, I signed up for the aviation lecture at Career Day. Our buses arrived a little late at the town next to us, and I hurried off. As I arrived, the colonel in charge was shaking his head the wrong way and said, "This is Career Day, not Hobby Day. You need to go find something girls can do." And I scurried past him as quickly as I could and sat down in the nearest empty seat, not out of defiance or courage. I knew the buses were locked. I had nowhere else to go. As I listened, it was thrilling. And as I left, I was completely bewildered. I hadn't heard anything that was beyond the grasp of the female mind. And growing up on a ranch, work needs a workforce. If you could do it, you were always welcome to it. If you could do it well, then you owned it. As I grew up, I got a little smarter at what I was good at. I went to the career counselor, assuming she might have some updated information and maybe a little encouragement. But she agreed with the colonel, so I headed to college to study and studied pre-med. As I was finishing school, I met another pilot. She was getting her wings in the Air Force, and I realized I had been basing my decisions on opinions, not facts. So with my degree in hand, I headed to the Air Force recruiter. It took me 2 years, 7 recruiters, and 3 branches of the military. But I found the Navy recruiter that would let me fill out an application and take the test. And within about 2 months, I was down in Pensacola, Florida, getting my head shaved and doing push-ups like everyone else until we all found a way into flight school. The haircut was not optional, and I am not affected by false modesty when I say it was not attractive. My mom told me to quit sending pictures home until my hair grew out. She said I was scaring people. As my hair grew out, I started flying the T-34 Mentor. It was a 550 horsepower turboprop. I arrived hardly knowing what an aileron was, and I was assigned my first on-wing, Captain Costin, United States Marine Corps. He had never flown with a woman before, and I'd never flown with a Marine. It was the second day that we both realized how steep the learning curve would be. He had demoed nearly everything the first day, and when we got to the point where we were going to practice landings, he said he would demo the downwind entry. he just said we were going to do the downwind entry, and he rolled inverted, pulled, and rolled upright on altitude on downwind heading. Having no flight experience whatsoever, I had been taking copious notes. This I just drew on my knee board, not knowing how to write it. The next day, he said, "All right, Bonnell," my maiden name, "show me that you listened." So I did the takeoff as he had directed, the departure. I did the different outlying MOA points to stay within the military operating area, and then he said, "All right, let's go do some landings." So I went to the same spot where we had entered the day before, and I rolled inverted and pulled. We know that Marines don't scream, but he was using his excited voice. And the fists pounding on the canopy told me that he wasn't buckled in quite as well for my downwind entry as I had been for his. It was my first major debrief item. I went on to fly the T-2 Buckeye, which is affectionately called the Guppy because of its resemblance to that fierce little fish. And while it wasn't a tactical looking aircraft, it was rugged. This would be the first aircraft that we would go to the boat in and do our carrier landings, traps, and cat shots. Now, up to this point, every phase of flight, we would do either a simulator or a dual flight with an instructor, many of them, before we would go solo. But in this phase of flight, the most dynamic we had seen so far, we would be solo the first and every flight as a student. They said they couldn't pay anybody enough to be in our backseat. In truth, they had realized that this is such a dynamic and changing atmosphere. We went there, this is pre-Top Gun, so we didn't have the carrier deck footage or the Kenny Loggins music to pump us up. And so my first glimpse of the carrier was in a four-plane formation overhead, and it was a lot of peripheral vision. Defying common sense, it seemed like the carrier got smaller as we got closer. And when it was finally our signal to come down and do the break as a four-ship and have our hook down and roll into the groove, it was to a boat that was moving away from us. The landing zone was at an angle and surrounded by water, moving up and down with the ocean. We realized they didn't want us thinking about what our instructor was thinking about what we should do, that we just needed to think about what we should do. And the boot camp mantra of attention to detail came into play as our safety net. When I finished T2s, I moved over to the squadron next door to the advanced jet training, which was in the A4 Skyhawk. And here's where the training wheels certainly came off. This was an aircraft built for light attack and used that way in the fleet successfully for years. It had been pulled back to training so that we would be able to have some tactical experience before we put on our Navy wings. So with the Delta wing and a very sleek body, we traded the stability of the straight wing tip tank T2 for this maneuverable jet and started doing fleet maneuvers, low levels at 200 feet, 400 knots, for a few hundred miles, hitting different checkpoints along the way within 1 second to be considered successful. We did some bombing and strafing. This was one of the phases of flight, the very few phases, I feel like, of aviation, where it becomes objective rather than subjective. And everyone got the satisfaction of knowing exactly where their little Mark 76 hit or their 20 Mike. We went on to go to the boat again, carrier landings, and then air combat maneuvering or dogfighting, which was what had drawn me to aviation in the first place. After I got my Navy wings, I taught for a couple of years in the T2 Buckeye, where I'd come just a year or so earlier. We had had a great commanding officer, Skipper Grant, Fred Grant, and I had always been the lone female when I checked in. This would be my fourth squadron to check in. And I noticed that my welcome was completely in the hands of leadership. Leadership always sets the tone. And Skipper Grant had made it transparent, being a female in his squadron. We all just focused on flying, which was tough enough. About halfway through my tour as an instructor, I was getting my advanced quals in carrier landings, teaching carrier landings and finishing up my guns qual. And we had a change of command. And with that change of command came a change of leadership. And one of the first announcements the new commanding officer made was that he was not happy to have inherited a female instructor and would not have one teaching weapons in his aircraft on his watch. So my gun squall was pulled and I was sent to teach out-of-control flight, rather publicly and punitively. But this was a stage of flight that everyone, instructors and students, had to do just one flight before they either took a student or went solo. It was very much what it sounds like. We would climb up to about 30,000 feet, depart the aircraft, initially in something benign like a series of stalls until the T2 tip tank fuel was burnt off, and then it would become a little more dynamic, zero airspeed with lots of rudder inputs opposing as we slid backwards, so that the aircraft would go and parade through positive, negative, lateral Gs until it settled into the oscillations of a flat spin. The students would divorce their mind from what they felt to what they could see and interpret and put in the correct inputs to recover the aircraft. If they didn't, by 18,000 feet, then I would recover it. We would climb back up, depart, recover, repeat about 10 times. I would often become familiar with what the student had for breakfast and help maintenance clean that up when we got back. But I learned some powerful lessons in that tour as an instructor, lifelong. The out-of-control flight would be something that I would use in my next assignment as an aggressor pilot and as a Boeing pilot on one particular day. And then the ground lesson of never letting an offense get in the way of a great opportunity, a lifelong lesson. I went on to fly A-7s in my next squadron, VAQ-34. We studied Chinese, Russian, and French weapons and tactics, and then we simulated those against our own fleet, from Top Gun students, other squadrons, single ship, and entire carrier groups. About that time, Congress was deliberating about lifting the combat exclusion policy, and the Navy was well ahead of its time in allowing women to fly anything that was not combat. And so we were the only branch at that time that allowed women to fly tactical aircraft in tactical missions. And as Congress began deliberating this, Rosemary Mariner was our commanding officer at the time. She was in the first class of Navy pilots, women pilots, and she was the first woman to be skipper of an aviation squadron. She I think had a lot to do with helping this come to the attention of congressional eyes. And our squadron garnered a lot of attention just because women weren't doing this in other branches. She chose a couple of us, Pam and I, to go train in weapons with the fleet-bound pilots before Congress had made up their mind. So in the A-7, we went to El Centro with all the other A-7 students at the time and practiced bombing and strafing in a little more complicated platform. We proved adept at delivering bombs and bullets on time, on target, and about a year later transitioned to the F-18 Hornet. This was something women had not been training in. And when we arrived, the shock wave was transparent and the attitudes extreme. I always come away from that thinking about how transparency has garnered such a connotation of virtue. And I think it's a little like yoga pants. I don't know that it's for everyone. But the jet was magical. If you've seen an obscure movie, Maverick, Top Gun, you will have seen some of the handling capabilities of the Hornet. It just took flying to a whole new level of taming and organizing 1,000 details into a wonderful economy of mind and motion, all to accomplish one mission. As I stepped out of the Navy, I started flying in an O2 over forest fires for a summer, and then landed, so to speak, at Southwest Airlines about 30 years ago. And it's easy for me to look back and to see that I have been given much in life. First of all, being raised in a family that cherished me, coming early to a faith in Christ that assured me there are no second-class citizens. So when I dreamed about what I wanted to do in life, I dreamed without fences around those thoughts. Having a chance to fly, serve my country, meet and marry Dean, and raise 2 kids, Sydney and Marshall, that I think changed the world. And work for a company that I will always be fond of. And in my favorite book on leadership, it says, "To those who are given much, much will be expected." And I think much was expected of me the day that I was captain on Southwest Flight 1380. But aviation is never a solo sport. I had an incredible crew that day. Darren Elliser was my first officer. Shanique Mallory, Rachel Fernheimer, and Catherine Sandoval were my flight attendants. As we took off that day, we met, most of us, for the first time. And we were leaving LaGuardia, New York, headed for Dallas Love Field, heavy with fuel, full of passengers. Headed for flight level 380, or 38,000 feet. When we were approaching 33,000 feet, we heard an explosion and felt like we had been T-boned by a Mack truck on the captain's side. Later, when Darren and I compared notes on the ground, we both thought we had had a midair, that we had been hit. The aircraft skidded sideways, pitched over in a dive, and did a snap roll to the left. 737s don't normally do snap rolls, especially at 37,000 or 33,000 feet. Both of us recovered the aircraft, and thinking that the majority of the upset was over, as we leveled the wings, the shuddering just crescendoed until we couldn't read our instruments or our checklists. And a roar began coming alive until it was at a decimal that just smothered every sound. Darren and I sit very close together, a foot and a half apart. We couldn't hear each other, but we couldn't even hear our own voice. And then, with some sharp pain in our ears and realizing that we couldn't breathe either, I think everyone in the aircraft at that time had a very isolated but adrenaline-filled moment. I remember my thoughts, and as Anne Morrow Lindbergh would say, to clear the underbrush of illusion, end quote. Adrenaline does not give you an epiphany beyond what you already know, but it does rack and stack your memory for easy access. And it seems to expand time so that your thoughts are leisurely, and yet they fit into a small slice of time because they are so fast. And I remember thinking that we may not keep all the big pieces on until we get to a runway. And it could be the day I meet my maker. Realizing I wouldn't meet a stranger, I got back to flying. Darren and I got our oxygen masks on. One at a time. It took both hands, both feet, and our full attention to maintain control of the aircraft at that time. And then, after we were headed to Philadelphia, I realized how startling it had been for Darren and I. It must be mind-numbing to the people in the back. So I made a quick PA and let them know we were not going down, we were going into Philly, and got back to flying with Darren. There was an unscripted combination of emergencies that unfolded on our way down, most of them becoming more apparent as we got closer to the ground. And in commercial aviation, we practice single-engine approaches multiple times a year. And a testament to Boeing and how well they're built, that you can fly on a single engine from takeoff to landing, no matter the weight that you're carrying within the guidelines of their weight limits. So we assumed we'd be using the thrust from the good engine when we leveled off at 4,000 over Philadelphia, which was the request. Darren, who was running the checklist, said, tell them we need a long final to get all our checklists done. I think we had 7 stacked up to do. And as we added power to level off, we'd been trading altitude for airspeed up to this point. The drag on the left was such that when we added power on the right, the drag pulling left was accentuated by the drag the thrust on the right. And aircraft don't fly well sideways, so we had to pull off some of that power and recalculate to a Boeing glider approach from that point. We were using a flap setting we'd never trained with, flaps 5 to give us max lift, but keep our airspeed up and not move the wing of the aircraft, the flaps, as little as possible. We had been turning mostly into the damaged engine, making left turns to get to Philadelphia. But now we needed to make one last 90-degree right turn. And the air traffic controller let us know it's behind you, his nice way of saying you're overshooting. And then he went silent. It was silent in our cockpit as well, because I was putting in the input, but we were not getting any results. And remembering one of those true stories, there were many of them that actually came to mind on the way down that day and helped make snap decisions because somebody else had already gone on that field trip. But I remembered Al Haynes, Captain Al Haynes, using asymmetrical thrust to get his damaged airliner turned and lined up with the runway. And it worked. We pulled off power. That put us below the glide slope that we needed to be on, but at least we were lined up with the runway. After Darren and I finished our before landing checklist with the flap inhibit switch added on, it was silent all the way down because at a certain point, the velocity vector in our heads-up display no longer was over the landing zone. To trade altitude for airspeed, I had to lower the nose enough that we kept our velocity vector kept creeping back to the beginning of the runway. And at that point, then we had to just accept the airspeed that we would get. And so we were well below the maneuvering airspeed of a slick wing, flaps 5, when we touched down. I say that to let you know it wasn't a guarantee for us that day, and there was no go-around capability. So we were very grateful as we touched down and rolled out. I stopped at the far end of the runway, pulled over into the circle of emergency trucks. I shut down what I should and coordinated with the ground crew what I could and got back to make an announcement to the passengers, to apologize. It had been a rough ride and more than schedules had been upset that day. And normally when things don't go as planned, passengers can be a little upset and aggravated, and I wanted to take some of the heat off the flight attendants. But I was met with a cabin of people that were attentive and calm and helping each other. I think the value of human life had been felt that day. We returned 148 people to their lives and loved ones. We were not able to do that for one passenger. And that will always be heavy on my heart, my crew, our companies. That evening, my husband, who's also a Southwest captain, Dean, called me, and he knew there was such a conflict in that day. The survival of many never eclipses the loss of one. But he reminded me of some ancient words of wisdom. There is a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance. I had heard those words since I was a little girl, but I think that's the day I understood them. Darren and I did not fly a perfect profile to Philadelphia that day, but we did keep our priorities in line. The crew pulled together as one. There were no silos of silence. What we needed, we asked for. What we couldn't give, we admitted. And the mantra that the Navy taught, aviate, navigate, communicate, certainly was a great priority setting. Boeing has their own. Maintain aircraft control, analyze the problem, take appropriate action, and maintain situational awareness. And that I felt like the crew did in spades. But as I turned off the light that night, it was interesting to me that aviation airplanes checklists were not what came to mind. It was people. And what a difference habits, hope, and heroes had made that day. Habits on a good day become our instinct on a bad day. We have no choice in this, but we've been given a generous choice in what we choose and groom as habits. Aristotle said, "We are what we repeatedly do." Excellence is not an act, it's a habit. Hope. We realized after that day that hope doesn't always change your circumstances. It didn't ours. We were in the same rough ride for 20 more minutes. But it changed us. When we had a destination, Darren and I problem solved from where we were to where we wanted to be. The flight attendants, hearing that we had a destination, unbuckled, got on their feet, and went down an aisle that was so rough it gave them bruised ribs, sprained back, cuts and bruises all over. Propelled by compassion, not by procedure. Passengers, Tim McGinty, Andrew Needham, Peggy Phillips, also unbuckled, got up, and helped complete strangers, all of them converging on row 14 where there was somebody in dire need of help. Heroes. I've given you the names of some of them. There were more, in and out of uniform. Many of them had no equipment, no title. But they were people who took the time to see and the effort to act on behalf of somebody else. And after getting to know them a little bit, I've realized they were not heroic that day for the first time. They had made a habit of giving hope to other people. Taking a step back to the beginning of my aviation career, I've had incredible people, both women and men, in my life. Rosemary Mariner, commanding officer that became a dear friend for 30 years. Sue Hart, Pam Lyons, Sue Fogarty, Linda Hyde, Brenda Shifley. The list goes on. And in men, I will mention just one, though there were many great mentors. But Dean Schultz, one of my off-duty F-18 instructors when I was learning to fly the Hornet. Amelia Earhart's quote, "Adventure is worthwhile," is not the kind of adventure that gives you a thrill for following an uncharted path. Adventure, I think, is that cord that pulls us through adversity sometimes. But it always affects more than just us. And adventure is, I think, part of our DNA. In closing, I'd like to wish you well, and in your adventures ahead, may he who from zone to zone guide through the boundless sky thy certain flight, and in the long way that you must tread alone, may he lead your steps aright. Thank you.
That was amazing. That really was very good. I think just the way that you phrase and focus on all those different portions of your career and the attitudes and everything that went into it. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Dorothy.
We're going to jump into our question and answer period. I've got some of them keyed up here, and I know that you can, if you're in the room, we have a microphone over there, and we'll be alerted to folks who want to ask a question, and online, you can just send them in. So I'm going to start with one person that you have mentioned already, because I think she's so important. In reading your journey, there is one person who guided you through several difficult situations, and she could do that because she had been there and then was now in a leadership role. So can you talk a little bit about Rosemary Mariner and her legacy in the Navy?
Sure. Whenever I checked in to VAQ 34, she was the XO, the executive officer, and within a few months, she became the commanding officer. And she had this amazing and quiet way of just approaching every problem. And she never highlighted the women in our squadron. She always would say quietly to the side, if you want to be part of the group, then you don't want to highlight yourself. And she had learned, I think, I remember calling her when she had moved on to the War College, I believe, when I had transitioned to the F-18. And I ran into a little bit of a wall where they had misplaced my training jacket, so they wouldn't be able to train me. And those things just don't really happen by accident. So I called her to say, okay, now how do I help them find this training jacket that has disappeared? And she had the practical way of, going through legal and ask for Freedom of Information Act. Anyway, she was always very practical, never reactionary. And that was probably one of my biggest takeaways from her, is to not be reactional when roadblocks were put up. And she was so helpful in maneuvering through an area that she had been the first to do a lot of things. And so she understood the different roadblocks that you would face in that, and how to kind of cut a swath through the jungle, but leaving it so that other people could follow you, so that you could still have camaraderie with your peers and your superiors, even though you might need to. For example, she had saved up money to send Pam and I to do weapons training, because she felt like you don't fly an aircraft well until you've flown it throughout its dynamic purposes. And we got down there, and Pam and I actually did quite well, and not because we were such excellent bombers, but they just forgot to take us to dinner the first couple of nights, so we had nothing else to do but practice. So we actually did quite well the first couple of days, and so they decided to just take away our bombs and bullets. And so it's hard to bomb and strafe without bombs and bullets, and make any score. So I called her, and she was quiet about it, and just helped reinstate, bombs. We never got bullets back, but we did get our bombs back.
Okay. Well, Wow, that's interesting, just to spread her knowledge and for help you folks come along without, obviously you were already creating waves, but, how to keep them somewhat calm so that you could make your journey.
Right.
Yeah. This is one that I've been interested in finding out. In 1984, a naval recruiter told you that he would take your brother, but not you. And another said that you had scored high enough on a test for a guy, but not for a girl. A decade later, seeing you in your first officer uniform, a male airline captain remarked, "Another empty kitchen." Are we making any progress here? That's what I want to know. And as we talk about what progress has been made, also let us know about your work on the recently passed Promoting Women in Aviation Act, if you could touch on that.
Okay. Well, I want to give credit where credit's due. It was the Air Force that told me to bring my brother, that they wouldn't give me any paperwork.
Sorry, Navy.
So the Navy did tell me, the first one said I'd scored high enough for a boy, but not for a girl. And there was one other in there that I thought, the empty kitchen. And this was one of Rosemary's thoughts popped into my mind, because she said, wherever you can diffuse it with humor, just diffuse it with humor. Don't escalate anything, which I thought made such good common sense. So when this gentleman said, another empty kitchen, I said, an empty golf cart. and he and I had a great trip together. But the recent bill that's gone through, I was on the Women in Aviation Advisory Board a couple of years ago. There was one board made up. And the part that I worked on mostly, I worked on a bunch of it with the other ladies, 29 other ladies. But there's some of it that I'm very, very pleased with in the medical area for pilots. And also realizing we were charged with finding out what are the barriers to women in aviation. About 50% of our workforce in America are women. But in aviation, it's about 6%. In cockpits, and I think mechanics, it's even lower, and C-suites, it's even lower. So looking at that, and truthfully, the barriers for women sometimes are the barriers for everyone. It's a complicated, costly path, but also figuring out a few things that women don't tend to, there's not a high percentage of women in STEM. And realizing that that's a rather artificial title that's been hung over piloting. When I'm not a STEM student, my husband's not a STEM student, and we've been flying for years. We flew with history majors, music majors, and realizing that there are some areas in aviation. If you want to design the airplanes, of course, you need to be a STEM student. But there's a lot of aviation, and as a pilot, I speak from that perspective, that arts degree is just as good. It will work just as well. And so opening up the mindset, I think, part of it, and realizing that we need to offer the aviation programs in the arts colleges of our universities, as well as the STEM section. So some of it is just perception by women themselves. They tend to choose what they can do, everything on the list, and men tend to choose what they can do, I think, 60% or maybe less, and they're willing to try it. And as women, we need to go ahead and step out and try some things that we don't know everything about, but we're wanting to find out.
Let's see. Oh, here's one that's kind of, you touched on it really briefly. What do many pilots do when they are beginning or between major careers? Well, they often choose crop dusting. And you mentioned that. Can you tell us a little bit about that side trip?
You know, I wanted to do crop dusting, but I flew over forest fires. One of my F-18 simulator instructors was getting ready to step out of it and asked if I would like to try that. And so that was like going back in time. It was flying. I'd come from a very competitive arena in F-18s, and then I'm flying with gentlemen who, I mean, I felt like we were barnstorming sometimes, but over forest fires.
Forest fires, right?
So it was just a lovely swath of aviation that was so opposite. I was, high or low altitude, high powered, and I went to low power, low altitude. And so I didn't get to crop dust because I got hired by Southwest by the next spring, but the firefighting was fun.
Okay. Do you ever question your decision to pursue aviation when training was particularly difficult or when perceiving discrimination? What pulled you through?
I think, of course, there were times I wondered, why? Why am I going through this? Or, would it have been easier to do such and such? But to be honest, at the end of the day, I would put it before the Lord. And I realized that my worth didn't change, no matter whether I made it through the aviation program or not, whether I progressed or not. But I also realized that if God gave me an ability to do something, then I had the, not only the right, but the duty to press on. I wasn't looking side by side to see if there were women doing it. I just saw something that I wanted to do. I grew up in a family that my dad treated me with the same respect and gave me the same responsibility as my brothers. And so I didn't think about that being an issue. It was just, can you do the work? And I thought, well, until they kick me out, I'm here.
Do you know what actually happened to the engine on that day, and how much of that understanding helped you to respond to that situation? So maybe you didn't know right away, but what did you,
we didn't know
Yeah.
until after we landed what it even looked like. We just knew we didn't have thrust. We had a rapid depressurization. The tearing and the shuddering never settled into a syncopation. There was always that sound of tearing. There was always a different shudder and rudder input. We found out later, really, when the NTSB report came out, but there was a fan blade that had sheared and had, by happenstance, exited at the 6 o'clock position, which had struck one of the big buckles that holds the cowling on. There's two of them on the 737-700. And so that was the heavy object that had hit one of the windows. A number of the windows had been hit, but that heavy of an object hitting one had caused both panes to give way, and that had caused our rapid depressurization. So we really flew in reaction to the symptoms, and systems knowledge and hand flying. The autopilot kicked off when this happened, and we never even tried to re-engage it, because hand flying gives you a feel for your drag. And we had bells and whistles going off inside. But as far as interpreting all of those, like it had severed, I believe, hydraulic lines and fuel lines, the rapid depressurization, and then the immense amount of drag, which we didn't realize just how much it was until when we tried to level off, we could not. There was just a vacuum on our airspeed. So, some of it we could just see. I could see on my side just the leading edge of the wing, and that it was chewed up a bit. But that's really that, and the engine failure was what we could see.
Wow. Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So this is the value of wearing pink. People see you, and so two questions actually. Did you ever consider the astronaut track?
Can you go to the microphone, please, so people online can hear you? Sure. It's down here. It's down over here. Otherwise, they won't be able to hear.
I'm just going to yell real loud.
I'll repeat your question.
There you go. Did you ever consider the astronaut track? And then the second question is just your thoughts on Linda Fagan and Lisa Franchetti.
Okay, no, I did not consider the astronaut program just because knowing a couple of test pilots and how much math they had to do, I knew it wasn't for me. But I don't really, I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with the two people that you mentioned.
So Linda Fagan is the Commandant of the Coast Guard, and Lisa Franchetti is the CNO.
Well, I should know those names, but what was your question about them?
Well, we're not getting it through. You really have to go to the microphone or we're going to just, we don't
Okay.
know, they don't know who you're talking about.
Right. The Commandant of the Coast Guard and the CNO, I don't know. They're both women, and I don't know either one of them, but I'm hoping and assume that they got there through merit and hard work.
Okay.
Sure.
Good. We do have someone at the microphone over here asking a question.
Did you have like a backup plan, and if so, like what was it?
You know, that's very smart to have a backup plan. In aviation, we always have, an idea of where we're going to land if something fails. My degree, I split it in agribusiness and pre-med, and so my backup plan was to become a vet. Very similar to aviation.
Mm-hmm. Well, you were familiar with that. You knew you'd been there and done that to a degree.
I'd done a little bit of helping in that
area. Let's see, where are we at? What are the main differences between your experience as a commercial pilot and your experience as a Navy pilot? Is it the type of flying and training? Is that the same, or what are the differences?
It's funny, they're very different and they're very similar in that there's always a crew concept. Even when I was flying a single-seat aircraft, then it was with wingman, division or a section, the mission. And so in that, going to commercial aviation and having two pilots in a cockpit, that wasn't new. Excuse me. The crew concept wasn't new. But commercial aviation, I think you're certainly in a little pod together for quite a few hours a day for a couple, 3 or 4 days a week. So your personalities need to have this polish of professionalism so that you focus on the job. And in the Navy, certainly there was this polish of professionalism, but you were often functioning a little more isolated than sitting a foot and a half apart for 3 days or 4 days together. And there was I happened to serve in the Navy and start in commercial aviation at a time when there was change. And change is hard for people, no matter which side of it you're on. And so the combat exclusion policy was being considered. And truthfully, we had gone along fairly smoothly, flying in VAQ 34, which was not ship-based, and so it wasn't something the gentleman really wanted to fly, because if you need to go to the boat to promote. And but once there was the idea of lifting that policy so that we were competing for the same jobs everybody else was, now opinions started coming out loud and clear. And then in commercial aviation, crew resource management was kind of burgeoning. And so that pilots the captains who had been first officers when the captains were sky gods, now they move over there and no more sky god. They're a king with a Magna Carta and they have to share. So it was just, there was a lot of change going on, and change always is upsetting, and people feel like they must voice their opinions now or forever be silent. It was also when there were a number of things, you have to be older probably to remember them, but tailhook had happened, and that upset a lot of carts. And Carol Hultgreen had an accident behind the boat and died, and so everybody had an opinion about that. And so I felt like I was just going through this turbulent storm that I didn't feel like I had any part of creating. But I do think the women that went through that, and like Pam and Brenda, two of the ladies I flew with in VAQ 34, went on to fly Hornets in combat, and Linda Hyde, A6s, and there were a number of others. But getting through that turbulent time, I think, was important, that there were ladies like that were in there at that time, and proving the worth of just hard work and excellent airmanship and head work and things like that to help the change move along.
Very good. Well, we've come to the end of our program here. I'm sorry for those who are waiting to ask questions. We are going to have Tammie Jo out in the lobby there, so maybe you can get in line and talk to her there. And of course, she's going to be autographing books for those of you who have brought some or want to purchase them. So I just want to thank you, Tammie Jo, for such a remarkable evening and joining us. We're so delighted to have you here. We've enjoyed learning about your career, and particularly your lessons of skill and tenacity and your faith. So thank you very much. Thank you all for coming as well.
One of the things we endeavor so much to do at this museum and see as part of our core mission, core goal, is to create inspiration. And we do it through our collection, our scholarship, our education, and through our lectures. And I can't recall a more inspirational lecture that I've heard in my tenure here at the Smithsonian. So thank you for sharing that. And again, it really bears my thanking, all of us thanking Pratt & Whitney and RTX Business, who allowed this forum to occur. So once again, thank you, RTX and Pratt & Whitney. And as mentioned, I don't want to hold you from your autographed copies from Tammie Jo's book. So we'll go ahead and adjourn now. But do hope you'll come back for future visits to this museum, to lectures, and partake in the work we do. Thank you for your support. And you can exit through the top doors and have a great rest of your evening. Thank you all for coming.